Hi, my name is Todd Carter. I'm a Principal Premier Field Engineer working for Microsoft. In this module, we will introduce many of the new improvements to the Visual Studio 2010 tooling added specifically for SharePoint developers. These tools will help SharePoint developers develop, deploy, debug, and test their SharePoint solutions faster and with more ease than ever before. We're going to begin with an introduction to the Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint developer tools. We will discuss the new SharePoint tools project structure and templates and talk about the process of adding SharePoint project items to a Visual Studio project. And finally, we will show some of the investments with SharePoint Visual Studio team made around the SharePoint tools extensibility that allow developers to extend and help shape the SharePoint tools to meet their needs. So let's dive right in with an overview of the Visual Studio SharePoint developer tools. As most anyone has done SharePoint development on 2010 will tell you, there were quite a few challenges to overcome. The lack of tool support was top on many of the developers' complaints. Many developers, like myself, came from an ASP.NET development background, where development issues were either non-existent or were just a simple copy command, and where F5 debugging was just that. Hit F5 and you stepped right into your code within the debugger. To a degree, the Visual Studio 2008 extensions for WSS did help. However, by the time those tools were released, many developers had already leveraged and incorporated community tools into their development processes. In addition, some developers found the extensions lacked the flexibility they desired and didn't offer a compelling enough story to move off their current scripts and tools. SharePoint 2007 developers were required to understand how to edit CAML and CAB DDL files, each of which have their own format and nuances. Files such as the manifest.xml, which may have included formatting errors, did not always point to the developers to the offending formatting. This sometimes meant much trial and error and sometimes required developers to hand edit these files. In addition, developers needed to be aware of SharePoint's root files or 12-hive folder structure and know where to deploy the various solution artifacts such as user controls, images, scripts, and custom CSS. Debugging SharePoint 2007 processes was not straightforward and required the developer to manually attach Visual Studio to connect to the correct instance of the IS worker process to debug their solutions. Developing SharePoint 2007 solutions required a great deal of ramp to understand the tools, files, and processes, much of which is pure overhead and do not contribute to the final solution being deployed. The Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint developer tools represent a significant step forward for professional developers using SharePoint. Within Visual Studio 2010, SharePoint developers have moved into a fully supported development environment. Project and item templates specific to SharePoint 2010 development are included along with many visual designers, which remove the need for a developer to understand or edit CAML-based XML files. These designers include things like features and solution packages, which automate much of the steps necessary when adding additional artifacts into the SharePoint solution. For those developers which chose to use the Visual Studio 2008 extensions for WSS, a tool will be released around RTM, which will help developers migrate their projects based on this tool to the new Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint Development Tools project format. The SharePoint Developer Tools extend Visual Studio's Server Explorer with SharePoint Explorer. This allows developers to navigate the SharePoint site hierarchy, features, content types, and lists. A property grid allows visibility into the important details which developers sometimes require when developing SharePoint solutions. Having the ability to navigate the SharePoint structure in this manner means that developers do not need to leave Visual Studio environment when developing solutions. For developers, one of the most appealing aspects of any development tool is the ability to customize and extend the toolset. The SharePoint Visual Studio team made key investments to allow developers to add their own custom project and item templates. In addition, being able to add new menu commands, deployment commands, and the ability to extend SharePoint Explorer provides the developer and the community with a huge opportunity to build well-integrated tools and add-ins which fit into the developer's workflow without leaving the Visual Studio IDE. At this point, let's take a look at the SharePoint Tools project structure. There's now a standard structure for SharePoint projects, which provide a consistent user interface and designers for the SharePoint-specific artifacts. There are a number of new project templates and items available when developing SharePoint applications. These project and item templates are fully integrated into the Visual Studio's IDE's Solution Explorer, Project Model, and Property Window integration, making SharePoint development within Visual Studio 2010 a first-class citizen. When a new SharePoint project is created, Visual Studio 2010 asks the developer for a URL of the site collection of a site which will be used as a target for deployment and debugging. The developer is also asked to provide the solution type which is being developed. For example, full trust or a sandbox solution is specified at project creation, however can be changed later if desired. The SharePoint project maintains an active deployment configuration which incorporates deployment and retraction steps and their associated order of execution. These steps automate solution deployment and retraction for developers to help speed up the process of developing SharePoint solutions. Like other Visual Studio projects, SharePoint projects can contain references to other solution projects or assemblies and can deploy these assemblies along with the main SharePoint solution. These assemblies can be deployed into the bin directory of the target web application or into the global assembly cache. Building a SharePoint project results in the creation of a WSP solution file without the developer needing to create or edit a DDF or manifest.xml. When viewing the SharePoint project within Solution Explorer, the developer will notice project nodes, which they're used to seeing, as well as additional nodes specific to SharePoint projects. The project nodes continue to maintain the same behaviors as in previous versions of Visual Studio, with context menus, properties, and in some cases specialized designers. Some of the more common SharePoint nodes are features and package, and will be present in almost every SharePoint project. There are numerous SharePoint project items, or SPIs. These include web parts, visual web parts, workflow, event receivers, and more. These SPIs cover the most common development artifacts used to create SharePoint solutions. As we will discuss later, additional SPIs can be developed as add-ins and used to create additional SharePoint project items. Map folders allow developers to create folder structures within Solution Explorer, which map back to SharePoint's root folder, without the developer needing to have to understand the knowledge of SharePoint's folder structure. The Features node acts as a folder which contains one or more features which are used to deploy various SharePoint functionality. The Features node contains a designer used to associate SharePoint items to features instances and to set the feature scope such as farm, web application, site collection, or web. The designer allows the developer to manage which SharePoint project items each feature will deploy by allowing the developer to add or remove SPIs. This can be useful when the developer is refactoring large solutions into various new features. The Property grid allows the developer to customize additional feature settings, such as feature image, title, and description. Context menu is available that allows the developers to easily add a feature receiver and feature resources with minimal effort. The designer also supports feature activation dependencies, which allows a feature which has a dependency on another feature the ability to check for the availability of that feature, and if necessary, forces the activation of the dependent feature. And finally, the feature designer provides a design mode and XML text mode, which allows the developer an opportunity to add additional XML text if needed. All SharePoint project types have a package designer. This designer wraps the functionality found within the manifest.xml and provides a designer which allows much of the common configuration previously done by directly editing the manifest.xml. You can package SPIs from any Visual Studio project within your Visual Studio solution, meaning that if there's multiple SharePoint projects, you can package them all into a single WSP solution package for deployment. Like the feature designer, the ability to add additional XML declarations is available in the packaging designer too, offering the highest level of flexibility when creating manifest.xml files. There is no longer the need for the developer to create and manage DDF files to support solution creation and deployment. The entire DDF, CAB, and WSP build process is completely automated. Map folders appear as normal folders within the Visual Studio Solution Explorer. It can be added to a project using Solution Explorer's context menu. Items added to these map folders are automatically provisioned to proper places on the SharePoint folder structure when the solution is deployed. Common map folders include the images and the layouts folder. However, any folder which exists under the SharePoint's root folder or 14 hive can be targeted for mapped project files. In some cases, such as when mapping the images or the layouts folder to a subfolder is automatically created and hold the current project's files. This has been considered a best practice and continues to be a suggested deployment option. The tool will help automate this practice for a developer, which helps drive consistency across development groups. The Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint development tools automate the solution deployment and retraction process. A deployment configuration contains one or more deployment steps, each which contain a specific step involved with deploying or retracting a solution. Examples of deployment steps include add solution, reset IIS, and activate features. Out of the box, we include two deployment configurations, default and no activation. The default configuration has all the steps necessary to deploy and activate the features of the solution, as well as the steps necessary to remove the solution. The no activation is much like the default configuration, except it does not include the activate feature step. This allows the developer the opportunity to attach the Visual Studio debugger and step through the feature event receivers. One of the first things that SharePoint developers will notice right away is how well the debugging experience has improved. Hitting F5 does a lot of previously manual actions, which are now automated for better developer experience and improved performance. F5 builds the project and packages it into a WSP file. If already deployed, the previous solution is retracted and removed from SharePoint, and the new solution is deployed and features are activated. To help speed up the process, we have added an auto retract option that makes retraction and recycle only occur if the previous version of the SharePoint solution is on the server. If it is not, then these steps are skipped. In addition, when you stop debugging, the solution is retracted, IS recycled, and a ping to the application pool starts the worker process, so it is ready for the next F5. SharePoint Explorer extends Server Explorer by adding a read-only tree view of the SharePoint site and its artifacts. It allows you to select an artifact in the SharePoint Explorer and view its properties while developing your application and without having to leave the Visual Studio IDE. In addition, several nodes, such as the list nodes, allow the developer to open a browser window directly into the context of the object selected. Like most Visual Studio tools within Visual Studio, the SharePoint Explorer can be extended to provide additional or extend the current functionality. It's important to note SharePoint Explorer can only be used to navigate sites which are running on a local machine and cannot be used to connect to remote deployments. One of the most common activities performed by developers is adding an item to a project, and we will cover that now. SharePoint project item templates are used to instantiate a new SPI into a SharePoint solution project. When you first create a new SharePoint project, the developer is presented with options for each of the common items to be created. SharePoint project templates can be used to add many different types of SharePoint project items into the same project, allowing the developer to build, deploy, and test a solution which may require functionality from various SharePoint project items. SharePoint project items, or SPIs, are the building blocks used when developing SharePoint solutions. SPIs behave as folders when used within the Solution Explorer. These are a logical collection of related project files, and the nesting allows for easier navigation of the project hierarchy. Each SPI defines different types of items to be deployed into SharePoint, as each is associated with a single feature, which is responsible for provisioning the SPI's functionality and content into SharePoint. Visual Studio Extensions for WSS forces the developer to create a new feature for each SharePoint artifact. With Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint developer tools, this restriction is no longer present, and many SPIs can be deployed as into a single feature. In addition, the developer has the flexibility to create a separate SPI for each artifact, such as site columns and content types, and they may choose to create a single or only a few elements.xml files. In either case, the packaging and deployment is fully automated. SPI files are the child elements of an SPI. A property grid can be used for each SPI file to allow for additional configuration. The most common configuration options include setting the deployment type and the deployment path for each file. Deployment types, such as the element file, elements manifest, identify the file and how it should be handled to the packaging engine, which then knows how to package and deploy the specific file. In most cases, the SharePoint tools set these values properly. However, when adding or modifying some items, it may be necessary to customize these settings. It is time for our first demo. In this demo, I will show you how to get started with the Visual Studio SharePoint Developer Tools and demonstrate how much the developer experience has greatly improved. Hello, in this demo, I'm going to show you some of the new Visual Studio Developer Tools that we have for Visual Studio 2010 and for SharePoint 2010. So what we'll do is we'll open up Visual Studio 2010 and we'll start a new project. And there's a new, this is the SharePoint Developer Tools, totally built in, totally integrated with Visual Studio. In fact, when you install Visual Studio 2010, one of the options, customizable options that you have is to whether to install these tools or not. So you can actually choose SharePoint here, 2010, and then you notice you have various project items available to you. We have visual web parts, we have a couple of workflows, different types you could create there. We have business data connectivity models, which we'll show you later in a different module. We have event receivers, list definitions, content types, modules, pretty much everything you would want to see here. If there is something that you want to have added here, you can actually do this. We have an extensibility model that you can leverage that allows you to add additional items here. Probably the most common is project type you're going to choose is going to be this empty SharePoint project. And what this is, it actually just creates you a nice empty environment so that you can actually add additional items into that. So that's what we're going to do here. So we'll call our project Ignite Demo 1 and we'll select this. Now, one more thing before I move on, let me show you something here. The .NET Framework 3.5 is the supported framework for SharePoint 2010. So attempting to create one of these projects, and for example, .NET 4.0 or 3.0 or 2.0 here is going to be troublesome for you. So you want to ensure that the .NET Framework 3.5 is selected here and is the default. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK. Now, it's going to start this little wizard. It's really just a one-screen wizard, but it has a very important question. It's going to ask you a couple things here. One is, where would you like to, what site collection would you like to use for debugging? Now, this site collection here has to be local, so this URL has to be local to the machine that you're on. Attempting to try to go off the box here is not going to work. So you can actually choose the validate, and it'll actually validate that the site is up and functioning. It is, and so this just makes sure that this is a local path. Now, the trust level that you want the solution is what they're asking here. Really, what they're asking is, what type of solution do you want? A sandbox solution or a farm solution? The solutions actually are identical, but where they're deployed is the real difference here. For a sandbox solution, we're going to be deploying it to the solution gallery at the site collection level. When we deploy as a farm solution, or what we might call a full trust solution, we're actually deploying just much as you would in 2007 within Central Admin. So we're going to go ahead and, for this demo, we're going to choose deploy as a farm solution and hit finish. Now what gets built for us or created for us is a simple project. We'll show you some of the properties here. These are much of the properties that we chose earlier. The site URL, sandbox solution. So you can see here that we can actually go back and still get to some of these items here later on if we want to. So you know, if you decide to change, for example, the URL that you're going to go to, or you may have received a project from one of your coworkers and they might have been using a different site URL, you can actually change that here. So the project that is created is much like other Visual Studio projects. We have the solution, and then underneath there we have this project node. So let's take a look at the project node. And the project node has this new SharePoint tab. And in here we can actually have various pre-deployment command lines or post-deployment command lines. So we can actually have commands that run pre and post deployment. So what's going to happen is the tools are we're going to actually build the project. It'll automatically build the WSP and it gets deployed as part of the build process. And so you can choose to have run various commands here if you want. Now we have a couple deployment configurations out of the box. We have a default and we have a no activation. And default, as you'd guess, is the default when you set up SharePoint Visual Studio Tools for the first time. In here we have what we call deployment steps. So you have many steps available to you, and depending upon your scenario, you can order these any way you want, or choose to include or exclude some of them, depending upon your scenario. And then what you would do is then name that deployment configuration, whatever you want it, name it your own personal name there, and then you can actually select that as being your deployment configuration. So you may choose to deploy something and then run a post deployment tool per se. That can all be done and automated right here. So in this particular case, for the default, what we're going to do is every time we hit build and deploy, it's going to run the deployment command, pre-deployment command, if there is one. You can see here, right back here, where we've got it blank right now. Then we're going to recycle the IS application pool. We're going to retract the solution. We're going to add the solution, and activate features, and then run the post-deployment command. And then when we retract, we're actually going to recycle IS and retract the solution. So now this activate, this retract solution is going to happen when it's going to try to retract the previous solution. Now it changes actually a little bit here when you look at this auto retract after debugging. So this is a new option that was added post beta 2. And what this does is it actually, once you're finished debugging, the solution will actually be retracted. And what that does is, by retracting the solution, and then we actually ping the application pool again to get it back up again while we're doing our debugging, while we're doing our coding, what happens is we actually can speed up the development process in that we don't have to constantly wait for the application pool to recycle when we're trying to debug. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Then we have this no activation. We can take a look at this guy. So this is a little different. The only thing that's really different here is we don't have the activate features over on this side. And the reason for that is that when you activate features, what's happening is it would be Visual Studio that's actually activating that feature. And you may have a feature receiver that you want to debug. And if that's the case, then you want to use the no activation to actually debug that event receiver. I'll show you what that looks like as well. So let's go ahead and close this down. Now we'll continue our walkthrough here. So we have a package which is effectively your manifest.xml file. So we have a package. We could choose to reset the web server if we want, and then you have various options in here. For example, you could add additional assemblies that you want to deploy alongside your application. So we are already going to build you an assembly automatically here within the project, but if you wanted to add any additional assemblies, you could. And then if you wanted to deploy them to the global assembly cache, or if you wanted to deploy them to the bin directory, or what they call the web application here, you can do that. Or if you have another location you'd like, you can do that as well. And then you can actually in here manage the safe control entries right from here. The other thing you can do is you can add an assembly from a project output. So if you had another project in this solution, you could actually choose that assembly as well. So it's kind of nice to be able just to have everything in one project and be able just to kind of link it all in, and they get kind of packaged up and deployed together. So that's really the package. Now, what you can do is you can actually see here
an example of what our solution package is going to look like. And you can see the Ignite demo1.dll is what's going to be generated from this project, and it's going to be deployed to the globally assembly cache. So, you know, really neat stuff here that we don't have to manage this and don't have to edit these things by hand. Should you want to, though, and add additional functionality, for example, if you had some resource files that you might want to include, you can actually go right into here and type right into this editor here and add those items. So anything that we don't support in the designer itself, you can actually add yourself right here. So let's go. Right now we have this features node, and there's nothing in there, but I'll show you what we're going to add some features for us automatically when we add certain items. So let's go ahead and add an item. In this particular case, we're going to add a new item, and let's go ahead and add a visual web part. So a visual web part is a new component for SharePoint 2010. You actually could create these in 2007, but what a visual web part really is a web part infrastructure that's actually hosting a user control. So the user control, we actually get the design experience of a user control, but we actually render that user control within a web part. So we actually get the functionality of a web part, being able to package web parts, move them around on a page, but then we actually get the flexibility in the design experience with the actual user control. So what we're going to do is we'll just add this. Add a web part. Let me actually go back here. I'll show you how we're going to change something here a little bit. Okay, so all the references are added for us automatically. We are, let me move this down a little bit. We have a feature that was added for us as well, right here. It was added for us automatically. We'll take a look at that guy in a second. You'll also notice there's all the files that were added for us. So the elements XML was created, as well as the Ignite demo web part CS. Let's take a look at that. And this is the web part class that was created for us with a path to our user control here. Notice what path it's putting it in. The control templates, it's using the project name, which is the Ignite demo, and it's using the Ignite demo web part name here, and we're putting the user control right into this directory, this path. So we're following best practices that states that whenever you use a global resource such as the control templates, layouts, or images, you to segment out your content from what's shipped out of the box, you want to use a folder, and that's actually what we've done here for you. And effectively what's going to happen is when this web part runs, it's going to the override for create child control is going to be created. We're going to do a load control on the actual path itself. That will instantiate the control, and then all we do is really just add that control to our control tree, and we're done. So really all of the logic and everything is in the actual user control, which is here. So our user control, we actually have a design surface here that we can actually use and drag and drop components onto this. We can actually go in here and drag maybe a button onto the surface, and we can go over here to the properties and rename the button if we want. So there's much easier to create a user control, a web part in this mode when you don't have to add the button explicitly here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a little bit of code here. And what I'm added is an update panel. So this is the ASP.NET's AJAX update panel. So AJAX is fully supported. It's here built in. Notice I didn't add any references, and I don't really have any squiggly lines here, so that's good. So let's go ahead and add content template. So this is the template. So all the content that we want to have rendered within our update panel is going to be within these two labels here. So let's go ahead and add a label. So we've added a little bit of code here to our project. Now we probably want to hit F7, code behind. So right here we just jump right into the code behind. Very simple. We'll just use the current time. And we'll just echo out the date and time here, just to kind of prove that it's working. So there's our user control. Very simple code to write, not difficult at all. But you know, the tools have made this extremely easy for me here. I haven't actually opened up and messed with any XML yet. Now let's take a look at some XML though. Let's look at this elements.xml. Now the elements.xml, what you'll notice here is we have pretty much the instantiation for us built right into where we need to put this, which is right into the web part gallery. So we didn't have to know that it was underscore catalogs / WP or anything, or the list ID was 113. The tool does it for us here. One thing we may want to do though is we may want to change this property. So it's group. By default everything's put into a group called custom, but we'll just call it Ignite Demo for now. And really that's the extent of our XML that we have to modify. Now you could, if you wanted to, go into this .web part. We'll take a look at that, and you could go in here and I can actually go and make this a little bit different name and description here. Very simple stuff to do, just to kind of customize your web part. Now one thing that was added for us automatically, notice, was this feature. So the feature was added for us because we need a feature to deploy this customization. So this feature designer opens up, and we can actually give the title to our feature. So I'll just call this the Ignite Demo feature. We have a place where we can put a description. We'll just do this here. And notice the scope that was set for us. Because we added a visual web part, and it knows that a visual web part has to have a feature scoped to the site level, one was created. If, however, we had a feature already in this project that was maybe scoped at the web scope, then what would have happened was they would have added an additional feature would have been added at the correct site scope for us automatically. So the right thing is done for us to keep us in good standing with SharePoint and Visual Studio. Now we have 4 scopes that we can create features at farm, which is the farm level, site collection, the web or subweb, and then we actually have the web application level. So right now we care about the site, so everything was done for us correctly. We can actually look at the items in the feature. So these little folders here are called SPIs, or SharePoint project items. And so these various items here that we want to include in the feature, or maybe not. So we might have additional items in the solution that we want to add or bring into these various features. We might want to take maybe 10 different features and maybe refactor them down to a smaller number. And really, by removing and adding these SharePoint items within these features is how you would do that. So it's a really nice designer. We actually have feature activation dependencies that we can add in here as well. So that makes it real nice. So if your feature depends upon another feature to be activated, we'll try to activate that feature first before activating this feature. And then, just as we had previously showed you, you can actually go in here to the manifest and actually see the XML that's being created for us automatically with the designer. And then if you want, you can actually go in here and edit this if you so choose. So in many cases, it's really not necessary to edit the XML, but if you find there's a case, we do allow that to happen here. So we don't, you're not totally just locked out If you just happen to love hand editing XML, you can still do that today. So one of the big challenges we've had with doing SharePoint development is the debugging experience and the F5 experience. So what I want to do is I want to show you what that kind of looks like here. So we've created our web part. It's about ready to go. What we want to do is we want to hit F5 here just to see. We want to open up, deploy it. What's happening is we're deploying. You can see here at the corner we're adding solution, we're adding features, and deployment succeeded. Right down there in the corner. Kind of went kind of fast, but we'll show you a little bit of what this looks like here. Okay, so our site is up. Now what we want to do is we'll go ahead and edit this page. And we want to go ahead and insert that web part that we just created. And that'll be under the Ignite demo. And there's our web part. So we'll go ahead and save the page. And there we have our web part. And then of course we have the Ajax functionality here, so that we don't actually have a full post back. I'm actually refreshing the page here. So you can see the time changing. As I change that, you can see the times changed. It's and so you can prove that it kind of works there. So it's kind of nice actually that we're able to incorporate Ajax functionality right here with just really just a couple lines of code. So let's go ahead and close this out, and what you'll notice here is we're retracting the solution. Retract succeeded. So now the solution's been pulled back and it's no longer deployed to SharePoint. And that's that checkbox that I showed you before, which was the auto retract of the solution. Now, one of the other things that we find ourselves running into, and one of the places where we've always had to edit manifest files or edit XML files and create these DDFs that we no longer have to create, is we have these we have images and various other components that we that aren't really code, but they are necessary for our project. And so we have these this notion of these what we call mapped folders, and we have a couple out of the box. So we have images and layouts, and what these do is whatever you put into these folders, they will actually be mapped or put or deployed into the right location. So underneath the 14 hive, we have an images, and we also have a layouts directory. And what we will do is, if you create an images map folder, for example, we'll do the same thing we did before. We take the solution name and create a subdirectory, and then anything you put into this directory will be there for you to use. So let me show you how that works. So let's just add an existing item. I have an image over here that we'll add. So this image will be deployed into the SharePoint root. Let's take a look at where it's going to be deployed into. It'll be deployed into the SharePoint root, template, images, Ignite demo 1 folder. So the name of it's actually demo PNG here. So you can see this is we consider this content. That's kind of that indication right there. And we will actually just take this and just move it on over there. We won't try to compile it or anything like that. It'll just be kind of packaged as part of our WSP and sent over there. So if I wanted to use this image, I could. Let's try to use this in our feature. So one of the things you'll get used to when you use the designer here, the designer has a lot of neat functionality, but there's also some interesting stuff over here in the property grid that I want to show you. And in fact, let's go ahead and get that path. Here, we'll copy that. And one of the neat things you get when you select this is this additional properties that you can have in here. So you've got, for example, image URL. So let's go ahead and use this image, and what we'll do is use that image for our feature. Now, the image URL assumes that the image is going to live somewhere in the images directory. So really all I have to do is just add the subfolder in the folder here. And I'm sorry, the subfolder name and the actual file, and that gets taken care of for us. We have a UI version that you can select, which is we'll talk about that in a different module, and you can choose what UI model your solution supports, and you have a versioning that you can actually put on a project. Again, we'll talk about that another, but you may want to you could now version your features, and then we actually support upgrading those features as well. So we'll go ahead and save that. And then, as I mentioned before, we can add feature receivers. Let's go ahead and add a feature receiver and take a look at what's happening here. We do that. Let's go to features. Whoops. Let's add an event receiver. And notice the class gets created for us automatically. We have our feature 1 event receiver created. And unlike the previous version of SharePoint, this class is these methods are no longer abstract, so you don't have to implement them if you don't want to. So in this particular case, I'll have a feature activated. So all I'll really do is, since they're all just virtual, I can I'll hit return here, and 9, and we'll just debug this, and I'll show you what that looks like. So what we've done, made a couple changes. We've changed the add the image. We've added the images folder. So let's just take a look at what this looks like. We'll hit F5. Now we'll wait for this to come up. And what you will notice is our breakpoint is not going to hit, and that's because our feature was activated for us by Visual Studio before the Visual Studio actually attached to the IS process. So we won't have that functionality available to us, but I will show you how we fix that, and we discussed that earlier. But in the meantime, let's go to Site Settings. Let's take a look at the feature itself that we deployed. And there's our feature with our image. So it's, I said, deployed it to the right location, and just everything just kind of works. So let's just take a look, step back. Now what will happen is we're going to recycle everything. Now, as I mentioned previously, these aren't going to get hit because it's going to be activated for us automatically. So we just need to make one small change. Go back into the SharePoint projects, and instead of default, we're going to do no activation. And so we'll save this. I will close this down. I'll hit F5 again, and what's going to happen is we're going to add the solution, but we're not going to activate the feature this time. And then what we'll do is we'll still attach to the right W3 WP process or the IS worker process, and we will start the browser. Once we're done adding the solution, the deployed succeeded. Okay, so now we want to debug our feature activated event. So now what we want to do is we want to navigate to the site collection features and actually activate or turn on that feature. So wait for this to come up. All right. And under site collection features, we'll navigate down to our feature. and notice that it's not activated, so we'll just activate it here. When I activate it, we jump right back into Visual Studio, and we have the debugging experience that we would have expected, given the Visual Studio knows which process to attach to, and takes care of all that stuff for us. So it's really nice not having to go into the debugger here. And typically what the experience was like was that we had to go to attach to process, and then we had to choose the W3WP process. So sometimes that meant selecting show all process and sessions, show processes for all users, and then we would actually navigate down here and find that there was maybe 4 or 5 W3WP processes, and that sometimes we could guess which was our app pool. So I always name mine really out of habit. I name my farm account, the farm account, app pool account, app pool account. So this gives me some indication of what, you know, what W3WP might have been what. So for example, in 2007 and as well as in 2010, the farm account was always the account that ran the central admin site. So this was indication that these were probably not the guys I cared about. This was probably the process I wanted attached to because it's my app pool account, and that's how I ended up attaching to it. So again, not really needed, so I'm glad never have to see this screen again. So that's really nice, and it will save us just a ton of time. So let's go ahead and just stop debugging here. And you notice we're down here, we're actually retracting our solution. Retraction succeeded. So let's jump out of here. I'll show you a couple other things we want to discuss. Server Explorer is something that's been around for a while, but we've actually extended it. The Visual Studio, the SharePoint Visual Studio team actually extended this, and so what we allow us to do is actually create SharePoint connections to our local SharePoint installations. So I'm actually connected to internet.hostofhosted.com, connect to the intranet site collection, and then I can see all my feature definitions here. Good list of them. Get some properties for these, and you know, the other thing is it's pretty nice is being able to see your lists. I jump through the list. I can see my list. I can actually right-click, and hit View in Browser, and just opens that list right up into the browser. So it's a really neat way of jumping into your site and taking a look at something if you need to. The list also has fields here, so I don't know if you're like me, you've used the SP list item, and then you're always trying to remember what was the name of that field that I have to type in here in the accessor. Well, you've got all the names available to you right here, so it makes it very simple, so you don't have to keep jumping back and forth or attempting to use IntelliSense to guess at what the name of things are. And again, like I mentioned over here, you have various properties to the fields of the different attributes. Now this Server Explorer, it just went away on me here, we'll pin it over here. The Server Explorer is all read-only, but it can be extended. So the functionality out of the box is all read-only. So it's a pretty safe operation to use. The other thing to point out is, and I might have mentioned it earlier, is that this has to be a connection to a local SharePoint installation, so it has to be running on this machine. It won't work going off the box. The other thing that we add is this Package Explorer, and this is another way just to look at your solution and from a packaging perspective. So you've got your Ignite demo feature. I've got my web part and the various components that make up that web part or that are necessary for that web part to operate. Then I've got my images all right here. So this just gives you another view. Actually, I use this view on one of the projects I did recently, where I actually had added the over here on the right hand side, I actually had added had a few features, and I had the same project item actually added to 2 different features. Now, the project system itself, when I built it, it told me, it gave me a warning that said, hey, by the way, you've got this web part being deployed in 2 different features. So it was a little difficult to see over in the Solution Explorer, but it was pretty clear over here when I went to the Package Explorer what the mistake that I had made. So Package Explorer is probably something you want to keep around because it is a pretty interesting view of your solution. It's a different perspective. Now, going back to this mapped folder for just a second, we can actually do any map folders here. So I mentioned layouts and I talked about images, but I want to do it justice here. We can actually go in here and the SharePoint root, which is you think about as your hive, in this particular case the 14 hive, you can actually use any of these folders. So if you wanted to deploy into, for example, template and then 1033 workflows. So for example, you want to deploy to a custom actions file, you could just map this right here, and then you would just drop in your file that you wanted to add that was going to be dropped into that folder. So it's very simple to use, and it's a very very neat way to actually build. This kind of builds all into your DDF. So let's take a look at what gets built for us. Now, much the same project layout and solution layout before. We have the bin directory and the debug. And notice we have the WSP that gets built for us automatically. So we have the DLL and the WSP gets wrapped up for us. So it's still the same, still just a cab file. We could still just open this up. The manifest is created for us. Still the same way, but we didn't have to hand code any of this manifest. It gets created for us automatically. Notice we get the solution ID generated automatically. We get feature IDs are generated for us automatically. So there's really not a lot that we need to do. One of the things that always pained me was getting this correct, was the public key and the culture and the entire four-part name for an assembly. Well, that's all kind of taken care of for us here, so we don't really have to mess with that at all. So, all in all, I think this is probably one of the most exciting, at least from a developer perspective, deciding features that have been added for SharePoint 2010. So I'm really excited to get started using them. And that's going to conclude this demo.
As mentioned earlier, one of the really nice investments made by the SharePoint Visual Studio team was to include the ability to extend the tool set to meet your needs. Developers can extend or enhance current functionality or add additional functionality across several areas, including Project System, Context Menu, SharePoint Explorer, or SharePoint Project. SharePoint Project System extensibility includes creating custom extensions or tools to extend the Visual Studio project environment. SPI and Context Menu extensibility allows the developer to create additional SPI components or extend existing SPIs. SharePoint Explorer extensibility includes the ability to add additional nodes or menu items. By default, SharePoint Explorer is a read-only tool. However, with extensibility, read and write operations could be added. And finally, SharePoint Project extensibility can include creating additional or custom deployment, configuration, and steps. SharePoint extensibility deployment has a couple of challenges that each developer needs to be aware of before diving into the extensibility development process. Visual Studio extensions are written for and run within the Visual Studio 2010. Since Visual Studio 2010 uses the .NET Framework 4.0 and SharePoint uses version 3.5 SP1, some translation needs to take place. In addition, Visual Studio is a 32-bit process, but as you probably already know, SharePoint processes run as 64-bit. Again, we need translation from one platform environment to another. Fortunately, the Visual Studio team has created a solution. A separate host process is used outside of Visual Studio, which runs as x64 and loads the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. It's this process which makes any necessary object model calls into SharePoint to execute actions such as deployment and retraction of solutions, as well as feature activations and deactivation. This process is known as the VS SP host process and uses remoting calls to marshal data back and forth with Visual Studio. Debugging SharePoint extensibility projects is also supported and automated by Visual Studio as well. Visual Studio launches another Visual Studio instance called the experimental instance. which automatically loads your custom add-in and connects to the VSSP host process. When debugging your extension, you are only connected to the Visual Studio experimental instance, so debugging any calls into the VSSP host process would require the developer to manually attach to this process as well. Now let's take a moment and run through a demo where we will take a closer look at the extensibility features available within Visual Studio 2010 and the SharePoint tools.
Hello. In this demo, we're going to talk about SharePoint 2010 Tools Extensibility. We're going to go through and show you a sample project that I've created that will demonstrate some of the extensibility features that are available. Let's go ahead and open up. Let's go ahead and open up a SharePoint solution, and let's just show you, kind of point out some of the different things you might be able to do. We're going to open up our demo solution we created earlier. This is the web part. Now, the things you can add or extend here, let's just go and look at, for example, add new item. The SharePoint project items that you have here, you can extend these, so you can add additional items here, as well as you can add, will actually turn into different nodes you can do here, add in here. You can add additional commands to any of the menus. You can also go over here to Server Explorer, and as I kind of mentioned earlier, you can actually add additional functionality in here as well. So you can extend this, the menu items. You can actually, right now out of the box this is a read only, but you could actually make this a read-write kind of experience if you wanted to. Those are just a couple ways to extend. The one way we're going to extend today actually is with the, we're going to add additional deployment step. And what that means is we're going to come in here, and as you may remember, we have a default and we have a no action deployment configurations out of the box. And we can add additionals if we want and customize these, but really what we want is you may want to have, what you'll notice, we don't really have a step, if you will, for upgrading. So we have add solution and retract solution, but we don't really have an upgrade solution. And that's available in STS-ADM, and it's something that we can add here as well. So the idea of the project is to add that additional upgrade solution as one of these deployment steps, and then provide a deployment configuration here called upgrade that we can actually select and then upgrade a solution. So that's the project we're going to do today. So there's a couple challenges with SharePoint extension development, and that is trying to handle, as I mentioned before in the PowerPoints, as I mentioned before, we need to handle the .NET framework differences. So the Visual Studio IDE actually runs the .NET Framework 4.0, but SharePoint actually runs in .NET 3.5 SP1. And then we also have the fact that SharePoint is 64-bit, and Visual Studio, the IDE, is actually 32-bit. So we need to kind of get around those, and the Visual Studio extensions that the SharePoint team has written that actually help us manage those transitions really nicely. So let's take a look at our project. This is my V6 project. So you're going to create a Visual Studio project, and you actually need to install the Visual Studio 2010 SDK. And when you do, you'll create a new project type, and it'll, in here under extensibility, you'll have this Visual Studio project, and this creates a V6 file. And I won't take you through this now, but I've already done this. Let's go back. So we've already done this here. This project. It's actually a class library, gets packaged into a V6 file, and I'll show you what that looks like here. Now this file is a zipped file. It has a manifest, and so has this extension manifest that actually explains or details out everything that's included in this package. Now, the V6 file is what you'd hand off to your developers and they would deploy and just install within Visual Studio. And that's what this project, this solution creates. We also have another project here, which is just a assembly that we're going to use, and I'll show you what we're going to do with that in a second. So the V6, much of this is already, all the references are pretty much added for you when you create this project. There are a couple references though that you do want to add in, and that is the system.component model.composition, as well as you also want to add in the Microsoft.Visual Studio. Let's see if I can open it up here. The yeah, right here, Microsoft.Visual Studio.SharePoint. My apologies. So those are the two extensions, the two references you want to add here. Then what you also are going to have is this manifest will be created for you. And what this is a nice designer. There's a lot of XML behind here. What you can do is actually set the various properties of your extension. So you can have an icon that I've chosen here. You can have a more information URL, a getting started guide. So these can be pointing to your own website. Then you also have the supported runtime. Now we're supporting version 4.0 and a min and max of version 4.0. Now that's important because Visual Studio, as I mentioned, Visual Studio 2010 runs in .NET version 4.0. And we also have a couple other items here that we're going to add, but let me describe those items to you first before we go through that. So with the extensions that the Visual Studio team, I'm sorry, the SharePoint team has developed, we actually have interesting way to go ahead and extend using MEF to go ahead and extend the functionality. So we have various interfaces. In fact, there's one called the iDeployment step that will override to actually create our upgrade step. So what we'll do is we'll implement this interface. This is kind of the pattern you'll use. You need to use this export type of, and then the type that you have here, so this needs to match. And then you're naming this as a deployment step. This is effectively your ID. So contoso.deploymentsteps.upgrade solution is our unique ID for this guy. Now notice that this does not reflect the namespace, nor does it reflect the class name. So this is just a name that we decided to give it some string that's going to uniquely identify this this step. Now, what's going to happen is our step, when it gets loaded, when we get initialized, this initialize method will be called, and then what we can do is some additional wiring up. So we're going to be passed a step info class where we'll actually set the name. So this is the name that gets displayed in the UI. So upgrade solution. We'll also give a status bar message. So when we're being called to execute, when we're executing, this is the message that will be displayed in the status bar. And then we also have a description, and this is displayed in the UI as well. So this right here is all SharePoint extensibility that we're adding on here. Then we have two methods that we need to implement. Let me collapse these down. One is can execute, and the other is execute. So the execute is actually going to do the real work, and can execute. If we return a boolean of true, we'll actually call execute. If we return false, it does not call execute. So it's kind of our pre-execute, if you will. So a couple things we're going to do in here. We're going to save off the solution, so we get past a context. The context, we can jump into the context, get the project, the package, and the model, and we dive into the model and get the name. So we actually get the name of the solution file. We're going to put the .wsp at the end of it. We're going to save that off. We're also going to get the solution full path. So this is the path, the output path that is being built, so where the WSP is going to be built. Then what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the project is a sandbox solution. If it is, we don't support sandbox solutions because we're trying to call a solution upgrade, and that doesn't work for sandbox solutions. So what we're going to do is we're going to throw an exception here with our message that says a sandbox is not supported. If we get past that point, then what we're going to do is we're going to do this is kind of a long thing, but we're going to do the context, we're going to jump into the project, and we're going to call into this SharePoint connection class. We're going to call execute command. Now, this command is kind of interesting. This is the way we're invoking or calling into our VS-SP host 4 process. So remember, this is the process that's running x64, and it is running outside of Visual Studio, and in fact it's running in x64 as well as running under the .NET 3.5 framework. And so this is the way we actually call over into or remote over into that other process. So we're going to look at that in just a little bit, but this is the method that we're going to call, and it's going to take a string parameter and it's going to return a boolean. So we'll take a look at that. So the other if the solution doesn't exist, we're going to throw an error here, and we're going to bail out. So this may be the case where we can't upgrade a solution if the solution didn't exist already or wasn't already deployed. So we don't want to attempt to run this command if that's the case. Otherwise, if we make it this far, we're just going to return true. Then our execute's going to be called. Now execute does sort of the same thing. Because we want to actually call into the SharePoint object model to do the actual deployment, we need to use again this same pattern where we call over to this execute command, and we pass it this upgrade solution, and then we pass the actual solution, the path of the solution that we want to upgrade. So we'll take a look at that. So these are what we call commands or SharePoint commands. Those need to be built. They're not part of this project because, like I mentioned before, they need to be run under .NET 3.5. So what we've done is we created the SharePoint commands project, and if we go look at the project itself, notice its target framework is .NET Framework 3.5, while our deployment step is at the .NET Framework 4.0. So that's the reason we actually need to separate this out into a separate project. Then we create this one source file called commands, and here's those commands that we're naming these commands so they can be found when they get to the other side of or within the other process. So we're identifying them as a SharePoint command, and we're giving them the ID. This is the same ID that's being used over here. Also notice, however, they do not reflect the namespace being used or the class name, because remember, we're calling between processes, and so it doesn't really make any sense to try to conform to or actually need to conform to the namespace or class, because we're not really calling a specific namespace or class, we're actually calling a specific command. So this command is actually this method actually implements our isSolutionDeployed, and really all it does is take the solution name that was passed in as our string, and then it returns a boolean indexing into the SPFarm local solutions store to verify if the solution's there or not, and then returning the boolean. Our other command, again, that needs to be run hitting the SharePoint object model is actually upgrading the solution. And so what we do is we actually get the solution path, we get the file name from that path, and we get a reference to our solution. Once we have the reference to our solution, we will then call upgrade on that solution, passing the full path of the new WSP that will be replacing this solution. So that's kind of how this works. So once we have this all set up, what we want to do, I want to show you so now we have our upgrade step, and now we need the configuration. So our deployment extension configuration is here, and we implement the iSharePoint project extension. So this is a project extension. This interface actually only really has one method that needs to be implemented, and that's this initialize, where the project service is being passed in. So if you've done any SharePoint or ASP.NET programming where you've actually written like maybe an HTTP module or HTTP handler, you'll recognize this pattern of this initialize, and then actually you get passed in an object that you actually hook up or register for events that you care about. So for in this particular one, we're going to register for the project initialized. We care about the project initialized event. So what happens then is we'll get called back on this event, and this is where we'll actually build our steps or build our deployment configuration. So we have our deployment steps, and then we have our retraction steps, and then we add that to our configuration. Our deployment configurations we'll call upgrade, and then we add our various steps. Now these steps here are the ones that are built in automatically to SharePoint, and notice the order in which we put them in makes a difference here, and notice they're all strings. So this right here is our Contoso .deployment steps .upgrade solution, which is the exact name that we have here. So that's kind of how we define that. So that's the IDs of our solutions, of our steps. And then the retract, we have the recycle application pool and retract solution. So that's a bit of what we're dealing with here. So what we can do is actually I can set a breakpoint on this initialize, and we can set a break can execute. Set that there, and then what we can do is I've got one here in the execute, so what we'll do is we'll actually debug this project. So what happens when you debug the project, we'll actually open up another instance of Visual Studio where we can actually, it actually will load or install our extension. And so this version of Visual Studio is being attached, our first version of Visual Studio is being attached to our second version of Visual Studio, so it's actually debugging. So we're using Visual Studio debug Visual Studio. Now, the way you determine which one's which, this one right here says experimental instance in the window, so that's kind of how you can tell this is the guy that's being debugged. So what we want to do is go ahead and open up a project. So we'll open up a, let's go ahead and open up a recent project. And we'll open up this Ignite demo project that we've been working with. All right, so it's open. So we'll just go ahead and maximize this. Now, in here, let's go ahead and close this down real quick. So in here we can go up here to the, excuse me, we can go up here to the tools and then the extension manager and verify our extension got loaded. And it did. So this is everything from the v6 file that we identified. These are those more information getting started links. So if we were to click on these, it would open our browser and take you to those links. And then this is the images or the icons that we chose. So everything's right here for us to take a look at. So the project itself, though, the functionality that we get is in here under SharePoint. Let's go ahead and move this down. So this is our our upgrade deployment configuration that was created. So we can take a look at this guy. Now, when we did that, we initialized our step. So we get called for our step, and so we're going to go ahead and run through this. Okay, so I'll just hit F5 here. And then you can see our upgrade solution step is right here for us to use. So it's in our upgrade configuration. So we're ready to use it. So let's go ahead and select the upgrade as our configuration. Let's see what the failure case looks like. We'll go ahead and save this, and we'll attempt to deploy. Now, we're going to fail because we haven't deployed this previously, so it's not going to upgrade successfully if we haven't deployed it. So just wait for this to fail. Now, we'll jump into here into the can execute, and we should actually land right down in here. And yep, we do. Can't upgrade the solution because it's not in this. It's not deployed. So we'll go ahead and hit F5. Yes, keep going. So you'll notice down here that we get our nice error messages letting us know that it's not going to can't be found, so we're not going to be able to deploy that guy. So let's go ahead and go back to the default. We'll save this. We'll deploy. Okay, so the solution's been added. Everything. So now let's select the upgrade. We'll save this. So now we'll go into here and we'll do deploy, which is really going to call the upgrade functionality. Now we'll go back into here to the can execute, and we should land right down here, and we do. Our solution exists, so F5, and now we're going to get called to execute. Now remember, this execute is going to call this upgrade solution. That's going to be in a different process, so we're not really attached to that process, so we're not going to be able to step into that, but I can just F5, and what we'll find is that the deploy succeeded. And so you just really quickly, you saw the upgrade occurred. So that's really the, let's go ahead and just retract the solution now. Retract succeeded. So we've actually built our extension, and we're able to debug it all within Visual Studio, and we're able to extend the SharePoint environment, the development environment, extremely easy. I expect there's to be a lot of examples out there, a lot of people doing this. Probably find a lot of code out there on Codeplex, things where somebody's done, 80% or 50% of what you're looking to do, and so there's a lot of great examples out there, just much like this one, that you can just kind of pick up and modify to fit your needs. So that concludes this demo. Thanks.
This module provided you with an introduction to the Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint developer tools. We discussed many of the advancements to Visual Studio and SharePoint development tools, which directly addressed many of the challenges developers faced while developing solutions for SharePoint 2007. And we also saw how the SharePoint development tools could be extended to provide additional functionality through Visual Studio's extensibility framework. We really hope you enjoy this module and invite you to review other Ignite presentations.